The 7th generation of consoles is probably the one where the console wars were most present. The internet had become mainstream, publication fueled the war for clicks, and the consoles were moving away from being built with proprietary components to being built with more genericized PC components, which meant that a large portion of the third-party library was shared between the Xbox 360 and the PS3. With such overlapping libraries, a lot of multi-platform releases were held up against the microscope, so that it could be determined which console was superior. While neither side could ever win that war, because there was always an exclusive that could be pointed to and a developer to be blamed for being biased towards one platform, it's clear now that the 360 with its more developer-friendly architecture has a better looking, sounding and performing library than the PS3, which was skimped by the PS3 processor, the Cell processor, which was, according to Sony and only Sony, vastly superior to the 360's GPU or CPU on paper. Regardless of what trend you fought in or is still fighting if you're a fucking weirdo, I think we can all agree that the 7th gen of games is a bit annoying to go back to, because of developers insisting that they weren't bad at making games but that 30 FPS was super cinematic and the right way to enjoy things. But there are games that run at 60 FPS. Not on the PS3, mind you, that console is a garbage fire on a technical level that struggle to even run games at 30. But there are games that run at 60 FPS on the 360, there are quite a handful, like a big handful, around 50, and I got about 15 of them right here, and I think you should look at them and see why there was a demand for them to run at 60, and how it achieved it. Let's look at some 360 games that run at 60 FPS. Let's get into it. Alright, so 60 FPS games can kinda be neatly divided into 5 categories: the Japanese style fighting games like Ninja Gaiden and Devil May Cry, fighting games, racing games, first person shooters, and the outliers. Not really gonna go too into the outliers because there is no red thread that connects them like with the 4 other groups. I have in my collection here Phantasy Star Universe and Kane and Lynch 2. So let's have a look at these and see how they get their frame rates that high and how they look. We'll start off with Phantasy Star because it's the easier one to analyze and to figure out how it runs as well as it does. And it does that by being a Dreamcast game. Like, look at this and tell me that it isn't a Dreamcast game. And if you need any further proof, let me just grab something from my shelf over here. It's literally just a 6th gen game uprest for the 7th gen of consoles, and that's not a bad thing. I think the simplistic and clean and semi-shell shaded visuals look great and even hold up today. And I played this for a while actually, just because it made me nostalgic for the twilight years of Sega and that look that Dreamcast games had. Kane and Lynch, on the other hand, is a bit harder to figure out. It's a fairly ambitious looking game. The locations are pretty huge, lots of interactable environments, lots of enemies on screen at once, and lots of effects. And on top of that, it doesn't feature any loading screens in the pure sense. The story will between levels continue as the lead characters have conversations during these interludes while the game loads in the next level. It's all really impressive. Halfway through the first level I figured it out. The game was heavily criticized for its strange found footage filter, even though the camera is actually not a character. and when I examined it I could see that it was hiding some lower res than normal textures. And the vomit camera that the game received even more criticism for, yeah, that's actually there to mask that the player character moved extremely slow, even when sprinting. The screen just shakes violently and lets him move a tiny bit faster, but it's not really a sprint. It would be the equivalent to me being like, oh yes, this is so fucking dramatic, aren't you drama? Are you fucking drama? Isn't this this is fucking drama, this is so drama, right? The game is technically impressive, but it's unfortunately not very pleasant to play. It's actually straight up unpleasant, so let's get a move on and look at some racing games instead. Burnout Paradise is interesting since it's an open world game unlike so many other games on this list, so it's pretty impressive that it achieved 60 FPS. In Burnout Paradise you drive around Paradise City, discover jump shortcuts and engage in races that you start from light crossings. How it achieves a constant FPS is that it down throttles the player's movement during the free roaming parts of the game where there are more vehicles in the city. When transitioning to a race, it drops down to 30 FPS while the race loads, and during this, it dumps all the NPCs on the road and mostly empties out the city. And the only time you're gonna see random traffic that isn't a part of the race is when you're in the lead and there are no other racers in front of you. It's really clever, and the 720p downgrade isn't actually much of a downgrade, and I prefer 720p 60 FPS to 1080p 30 FPS any day, especially in a racing game like this where things move so fucking fast. Grid 2 I think is a lot closer to the rest of the racing games that run in 60 FPS mode. It's 1080p and the action is set in fairly simple levels with beautiful skyboxes and distant objects that don't take much power to render, and there are never more than 8 cars on screen at the same time, so compared to a game like most 3D games, there isn't a lot of stuff here to render and pull off, so it makes sense that not only can the texture size of the cars be pushed really fast past standard, so can the FPS. And that's more or less also the case with fighting games. Super Street Fighter 4 is very simplistic, and I imagine it is that way on purpose so that the FPS will stay at a rock hard 60 to meet the demands of the competitive multiplayer scene. Virtua Fighter 5 has a bit more going on for it in the visual department. The characters are more detailed and it's not strictly a 2D fighter, and features larger levels and even more moving elements like the people in the background. However, if we zoom in on them, we can see that they are extremely low poly so that they take up as little memory as possible. Dead or Alive brings a little more to the table, like destructible environments, multiple screen transitions during fights, a faster paced fighting speed, and of course, the real-time jiggle physics. Regardless of whether or not you're into it, you gotta appreciate the craftsmanship that went into creating these bazongas. They probably bounce a little too much, but it is impressive that they bounce differently depending on what size and what garment is holding them up. And I imagine it has to take a fair bit of computing power to calculate these honkers, especially if there are multiple pairs on screen at the same time. But generally I'm not super impressed with these 60 FPS fighting games, but I think it's largely due to the fact that fighting games have always run this well, and while racing games have as well, I'm probably just thinking that it's more impressive with racing games because I'm used to seeing the driving in GTA, which runs at 30 FPS, and it's nice to play a racing game at 60 and have those extra frames. And it's because it really makes a difference when you're trying to do those hairpin turns, I believe they're called in English. If you liked how I talked about big titties just a few minutes ago, and you're worried that the rest of the video won't have any more big titties, don't be, because we aren't leaving the big titted world of Dead or Alive behind completely, because next up we're gonna talk about some Japanese style action games. And we might as well start off with Ninja Gaiden 2 and Ninja Gaiden 3. Ninja Gaiden 2 and Ninja Gaiden 3, Dante's Inferno, Devil May Cry, they all more or less achieved their 60 FPS the same way. The action is a bit pulled out so that the textures can be a bit lower res, especially the background things. There aren't a lot of items on screen or a lot of enemies, and the levels are fairly closed off and geometrically quite simple, and even though it looks like you're fighting hundreds of enemies, you're actually just fighting 8 at a time, and reinforcements jump into the action every time one on-screen dies. The only real difference between these games is that the older games like DMC4 and Ninja Gaiden 2, released in the late 2000s, uses actual loading screen between level transitions, and the younger games like Dante's Inferno and Ninja Gaiden 3 uses the method of gating the player into narrow corridors where there is a fixed camera perspective, and uses the time in those narrow corridors to unload the previous area and load in the new one, so that it will seem that the game didn't load, even though it did. However, in Ninja Gaiden 3 case it's kind of impressive because it does it in only 2 seconds when you slide into the narrow passage very quickly. Like with the racing games and the hairpin turns, the 30 extra frames in this really does make blocking incoming attack considerably easier, and I think I missed a total of 5 blocks across my combined 4 hours with these games, and if I had played something like the DMC remake, DMC, that only runs at 30 FPS, I would probably have missed a lot more. But mechanically the fighting, the racing and the action games, they're not that interesting all around. It's obvious how they achieve such a high FPS, and that's not meant to be taken in a negative way. I appreciate that they do this, and the fact that they do it is impressive. It's just that the techniques are very transparent. First-person shooters, on the other hand, that is a completely different bag. Sure, it uses the exact same tricks, but it hides them so well, and it really pushes the limits of what can be done with these methods. Like action games have clearly defined arenas for fighting and narrow passages to facilitate the unload of the previous area and the loading in of the next area. While games like Bioshock, Modern Warfare and Rage do this as well, the arenas are so much bigger. And there is so much more going on in them, and they feature quite a lot of clutter, action and effects. And they feature narrow passages like those games, but instead of being a literal narrow passage, it can be a tunnel in Bioshock 1 that explodes and shakes the screen, disguising a loading screen, or in Bioshock 2, where you fall through a floor and into water, and when you hit it, the game slows down to about 8 FPS, disguises it with bubbles and screen effects, and unloads the above area and loads in the one you're in now. Or more obviously in Bioshock Infinite, where you are literally waiting for the level to appear, because it's a flying object that floats majestically towards you. Rage, however, I can't really explain that, or parts of Modern Warfare either for that matter. I think these games might just have been so insanely well optimized that it allows them to feature more objects on screen than their contemporaries. However, Rage is an open world RPG that features big sprawling levels full of enemies and has extremely fast moving vehicles, and you blaze across the game's canyon so fucking fast, and there's only a very short loading screen in between the overworld and entering a settlement and vice versa. And I don't really got an explanation for how it does that, because it shouldn't be able to on the hardware it's running on. Sure, I sometimes caught the game not loading in an object quick enough if I turned 180 degrees really fast. So I'm guessing that it somehow unloads and loads the textures in the game in real time and displays everything behind the player as a mushy, low poly and low textured mess. But still, it's really fucking impressive, and the gold medal for the most impressive game on the 360, if there was one, would absolutely go to this game, no fucking contest. So that was a cursory look at the 60 FPS games on the 360. Are they better? Absolutely. Did I care at the time? Not really. It's cool that they did it, and it was fun to figure out how they did it. But most of my enjoyment from looking at these games came not from how well they ran, but from the games themselves. Because I played a lot of games that I hadn't played a lot or even at all. And I'm definitely going back to the Bioshock games and Rage because even though I've played them a bunch before, they finally click for me, you know? And now I'm hyped for them. But that's how I feel. How do you feel? Do you even care that there are games on the 7th gen that run at 60 FPS? Tell me down below, or on Twitter, or on the Discord. There are links down in the description, along with a link to a complete list of 60 FPS 360 games. Until next time, bye bye.